again. Ma'am, step away from first class. This section isn't for your demographic.
The words sliced through the marble-floored sanctuary of JFK Terminal 5's elite Crown Lounge like a blade through silk. Carmen Rodriguez, head concierge of the most exclusive airport lounge in New York, delivered the statement with practiced precision, her manicured finger pointing toward the exit as if directing traffic away from a crime scene. The woman standing before her didn't flinch. Victoria Monroe, 36 years old, with skin the color of rich mahogany and eyes that held the quiet storm of someone who had climbed mountains others didn't even know existed, remained perfectly still. She wore a simple black turtleneck dark jeans without designer labels and carried a worn leather messenger bag that had seen 1,000 boardrooms. Nothing about her screamed wealth. Everything about her whispered power. Behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Crown Lounge, Manhattan's skyline stretched endlessly, a testament to dreams built and fortunes won. The lounge itself cost $2,000 annually, just for membership invitation only, for those whose bank accounts matched their egos. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars. The air smelled of premium Colombian coffee, aged whiskey, and that particular sterile silence that only money could buy. Victoria stepped closer to the mahogany desk where Carmen sat like a gatekeeper to paradise. "I have a reservation," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Flight 847 to Geneva, first-class seat 1A. Carmen's expression didn't change, but her eyes performed a quick inventory scan cataloging Victoria's appearance with the efficiency of a customs agent looking for contraband. No Hermes scarf, no Louboutin heels, no jewelry worth mentioning. Just a black woman who clearly didn't understand the rules of engagement in spaces like this. "The business class lounge is downstairs," Carmen replied, her tone dripping with the kind of helpful condescension that made it clear she was doing Victoria a favor by pointing out the obvious. "Turn left at the escalator, then follow the blue signs. They'll take good care of you there." Victoria placed her boarding pass and passport on the polished surface between them. "I said, first class, seat 1A. Please check me in." The heavy glass doors of the lounge swung open with a whispered whoosh, and the atmosphere immediately shifted. Bradford Ashworth III entered like a king returning to his castle, his voice booming across the space as he barked orders into his phone. "Jerry, I don't care what the market's doing right now. Close the deal or find someone who will. I'm not paying you to make excuses." Bradford was 52 years old and looked exactly like Central Casting would order for the role of entitled billionaire. His Armani suit fit like a second skin tailored to accommodate his expanding waistline while still projecting authority. A gold Rolex Submariner caught the light as he gestured, and his Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. Carmen's entire demeanor transformed the moment she saw him. Her spine straightened, her smile became genuine, and she practically leaped to her feet. "Mr. Ashworth, welcome back. Your usual suite is ready, and I've already arranged for your Dom Perignon to be chilled. How was the helicopter ride from the Hamptons?" Bradford ended his call with a satisfied grunt and approached the desk, completely ignoring Victoria as if she were part of the furniture. "Traffic was a nightmare on the ground, Carmen. Thank God for private aviation. I need to be wheels up by 3:15 sharp. The Swiss don't wait for anyone, not even me." He laughed at his own joke, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling like the bark of a well-fed seal. Carmen laughed too, because that's what people did when Bradford Ashworth III made jokes. Victoria cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, I was checking in." Bradford noticed her for the first time, his eyes performing the same quick scan Carmen had done, but with even less subtlety. He took in her simple clothes, her lack of obvious wealth markers, her quiet confidence, and reached the same conclusion that had been reached 1,000 times before in spaces like this. "Oh, sweetheart." he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is the Crown Lounge. The regular terminal is back through those doors. The attendants downstairs can help you find your gate." Michael Thompson, a 15-year veteran of the airline industry and senior lounge attendant, approached from behind the bar where he'd been polishing crystal glasses. Michael was 45 with graying temples and the kind of respectful demeanor that came from years of military service before his civilian career. His wife was a civil rights attorney, a detail that would become relevant sooner than anyone expected. "Is there a problem here?" Michael asked, though his tone suggested he already knew what kind of problem it was. Carmen held up Victoria's boarding pass like evidence in a trial. "She says she has first class to Geneva, but—" She let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear without being stated. Bradford glanced at the boarding pass and snorted. "Geneva? What business could she possibly have in Geneva? That's where the real players handle real money. No offense, honey, but you don't exactly look like Swiss banking material." Victoria's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered behind her eyes. A calculation. A decision being made in real time. "I have a meeting with the governors of the Swiss National Bank," she said quietly. "We're discussing the implementation of new fintech protocols across European markets." The words hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. Bradford's smirk faltered for just a moment before returning full force. "Fintech protocols," he repeated, tasting the words like a wine he suspected had gone bad. "Right. And I'm the Pope. Look, sweetheart, I admire the confidence, I really do, but some people just don't know their place." Carmen nodded eagerly, emboldened by Bradford's support. "Sir, perhaps we should call security. Sometimes people wander up here by mistake, and it can cause confusion for our actual members." Michael shifted uncomfortably behind the bar. Something about this situation felt wrong to him, felt familiar in the worst possible way. But he was 2 years from retirement, and controversies had a way of following people home. Victoria reached into her messenger bag and withdrew a titanium black card, placing it next to her passport. The card was completely unmarked except for a small logo that Carmen didn't recognize but that made Bradford's eyebrows rise slightly. Centurion Black Victoria said simply, "Invitation only. 500,000 minimum balance required for consideration." Carmen picked up the card with obvious reluctance, as if it might explode in her hands. She ran it through her scanner, and for a moment the only sound in the lounge was the quiet hum of the machine processing information that would change everything. The scanner beeped green. Carmen frowned, typed something into her computer, then frowned deeper. "There must be some kind of system error," she muttered. Bradford leaned over the desk, reading the screen upside down, with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been told that other people's business was none of his. "What's it say?" "It says." Carmen paused, clearly struggling with the cognitive dissonance between what she was seeing and what she believed should be true. "It says the account is verified. Platinum status. Credit limit." "Well, it just says unlimited." Bradford's laugh boomed across the lounge again, but this time it sounded forced. "Those cards are easy to fake these days. She probably bought it online." "Carmen, call your manager." "This is getting ridiculous." From across the lounge near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac, James Parker looked up from his laptop. 26 years old, with the lean build of someone who spent more time traveling than sleeping, James had built a following of 500,000 subscribers on his travel blog by documenting the absurd inequalities he encountered in premium travel. His camera instincts were razor-sharp, and right now every instinct was screaming that something extraordinary was about to happen. James discreetly activated the camera on his phone, angling it to capture the scene at the front desk. He'd seen this script before. Wealthy white man assumes black woman doesn't belong in first class. Usually it ended with quiet humiliation and someone moving to a different seat. But something about the woman's stillness suggested this story might have a different ending. Victoria looked at Carmen, then at Bradford, then back at Carmen. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had faced this exact situation more times than anyone should have to. "I understand your confusion," she said, each word measured and precise. "You see a black woman without obvious designer labels, and you make assumptions about what I can afford. You've been trained to read wealth like a code, and I don't fit your algorithm." She paused, allowing the silence to settle like dust after an explosion. "But here's what you don't understand. I didn't dress to impress you. I dressed to work, and the work I do requires meetings with people who value substance over style, results over reputation." Bradford interrupted with a wave of his manicured hand. "Oh, spare us the lecture, sweetheart. This isn't about race, it's about class. Some people earn their way into spaces like this, and others try to sneak in through the back door." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Victoria's composure didn't crack, but something fundamental shifted in the atmospheric pressure of the room. James's camera captured the moment perfectly, the instant when quiet dignity transformed into something far more dangerous. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Ashworth," Victoria said, and Bradford's chest puffed with the satisfaction of someone who had just won a debate. "This is about class. The question is whether you have any." The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Michael set down his crystal glass with hands that had begun to shake. Bradford's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a particular hue that suggested his blood pressure medication might need adjustment. "Did you just—" Bradford sputtered, his sense of reality temporarily short-circuiting. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying him with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Bradford Ashworth III, real estate developer. Inherited your company from your grandfather, who inherited it from his father, who actually built it. You're worth approximately $400 million. Most of it tied up in Manhattan properties that are currently over-leveraged due to your expansion into the Miami market 3 years ago." The accuracy of her assessment hit Bradford like a physical blow. Carmen stared at Victoria with new eyes, suddenly uncertain about everything she thought she knew about the situation. "You've done your homework," Bradford said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "But research doesn't buy you a seat at the big kids' table. I own half the buildings between here and Central Park. I don't need to prove anything to anyone, especially not to someone who doesn't even belong in this lounge." Victoria reached into her bag again, this time withdrawing her phone. It wasn't an iPhone or a Samsung, but something sleek and black with no visible branding. A device that looked like it belonged in the hands of someone who dealt with information too sensitive for commercial networks. "You're right," she said, unlocking the phone with her thumbprint. "You don't need to prove anything to me, but you might want to start thinking about what you're going to prove to your creditors." Bradford laughed, but the sound had lost its earlier confidence. "My creditors. Sweetheart, I am the creditor. People owe me money." Victoria's thumb hovered over her phone screen, specifically over a single red icon, labeled with a number that James's camera couldn't quite capture. "Everyone has a boss, Bradford. Even you." She looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time in the conversation, Bradford felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: uncertainty. "The question is," Victoria continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "are you absolutely sure you want to find out who mine is?" The tension in the elite Crown Lounge had become thick enough to cut with a knife. Bradford Ashworth III stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, processing Victoria's last words like a computer trying to parse corrupted data. The woman in front of him had just demonstrated knowledge of his financial situation that only his accountants and bankers should possess, and she'd done it with the casual confidence of someone reading the weather report. Victoria Monroe had learned long ago that power wasn't about the clothes you wore or the car you drove. Power was about information timing and the ability to remain calm while everyone around you lost their minds. These lessons had been carved into her soul through experiences that would have broken lesser people. She was 8 years old when she first understood that the world would judge her differently. Her mother, Patricia Monroe, worked 3 jobs to keep their Detroit apartment, often leaving Victoria with neighbors who weren't always kind. The day young Victoria announced she wanted to be a scientist, Mrs. Henderson from across the hall had laughed and said, "Baby girl, people like us don't become scientists. We clean up after them." Patricia Monroe had different ideas. She worked nights at a hospital, weekends at a grocery store, and early mornings cleaning offices downtown, saving every penny for Victoria's education. When Victoria scored a perfect 1600 on her SATs, Patricia cried for 3 hours straight. When MIT offered a full scholarship, she cried for 3 more. At MIT, Victoria discovered that brilliance wasn't enough. She was often the only black face in lecture halls filled with students who had attended prep schools that cost more than her mother made in a year. She learned to speak their language, to navigate their social codes, to prove herself twice as hard for half the recognition. By 19, she had built her first mobile app, a simple financial tracking tool that helped low-income families manage their money. The tech blogs ignored it, but the people who needed it most downloaded it by the millions. When Goldman Sachs offered to buy it for $50 million, Victoria's professors told her she'd won the lottery. She took the money, graduated summa cum laude, and immediately started her next company. Montech Financial began as a simple idea. What if banking was designed for people who actually needed it, instead of people who already had everything? What if financial services were built with empathy instead of exploitation? By 25, Victoria had revolutionized mobile banking for underserved communities. By 30, Montech Financial was processing more transactions than some regional banks. By 36, she controlled a financial empire worth billions, with tentacles reaching into every corner of the global economy. The irony wasn't lost on her. The girl who had been told she'd never be more than a janitor now held the financial future of men like Bradford Ashworth in the palm of her hand. Bradford, meanwhile, represented everything Victoria had fought against. Born into wealth that traced its roots to railroad money, he had attended Phillips Exeter Academy, then Yale, where his family's donations ensured admission regardless of academic performance. He inherited Ashworth Properties when his father died of a heart attack at 58, leaving behind a company built on the backs of 3 generations of other people's labor. Under Bradford's leadership, Ashworth Properties had expanded aggressively, buying up Manhattan real estate and leveraging it to the hilt for bigger and bigger deals. He was the kind of businessman who confused luck with skill, who attributed his success to genius rather than inheritance. What Bradford didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined, was that his aggressive expansion had made him dependent on a web of financial institutions that all led back to one source, Montech Financial. His loans, his credit lines, his entire empire was built on a foundation that Victoria Monroe controlled with the press of a button. Carmen Rodriguez watched the standoff between Victoria and Bradford with growing unease. At 28, Carmen had worked her way up from cleaning airplanes to managing the Crown Lounge, supporting her elderly parents and putting her younger brother through college. She knew the unwritten rules of her job. Certain passengers got certain treatment based on certain assumptions. Carmen had learned to read the signals. Designer bags meant VIP treatment. Rolex watches meant priority seating. Black or Hispanic faces meant extra scrutiny, extra questions, extra reasons to doubt. She'd never questioned these patterns because questioning meant risking her job, and her job meant her family's survival. But watching Victoria calmly dismantle Bradford's assumptions was making Carmen realize that maybe, just maybe, she'd been reading the wrong signals all along. Michael Thompson felt the weight of 15 years in the airline industry pressing down on his shoulders. He'd seen situations like this before, and they never ended well for people who looked like Victoria. The smart move was to stay quiet, keep his head down, and let management handle whatever was about to explode. But Michael's wife, Sarah Thompson, was a civil rights attorney who spent her days fighting the exact kind of discrimination he was witnessing right now. Every night she came home with stories of clients who had been judged, dismissed, and humiliated because of how they looked instead of who they were. Michael had always nodded sympathetically, thinking those problems happened somewhere else to someone else. Now he was staring at his wife's work happening right in front of him, and his silence was making him complicit. James Parker's live stream had attracted 50,000 viewers in the past 10 minutes, and the comments were exploding faster than he could read them. #Crown Lounge. Showdown was starting to trend, and travel bloggers across the platform were sharing his feed. James had stumbled onto something bigger than a typical airline discrimination story. The woman at the center of this wasn't just any passenger. Something about her calm confidence, her specific knowledge of Bradford's finances, suggested she was someone important. Very important. Victoria looked at her phone again, checking the time with the casual gesture of someone who had places to be and people to disappoint. "Mr. Ashworth, I'm going to give you one opportunity to apologize for your behavior and walk away from this situation with your dignity intact." Bradford's face contorted with indignation. "Apologize to you? For what? Pointing out that you don't belong here? For assuming that belonging is determined by the color of someone's skin rather than the content of their bank account," Victoria replied. "For treating airport staff like your personal servants. For speaking to me as if I were your property instead of your equal." She paused, allowing each word to land with precision. "And most importantly, for being absolutely certain that you're untouchable when you're actually standing on quicksand." Bradford threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing off the marble walls like the cry of a dying animal. "Quicksand lady. I own this city. I own buildings worth more than small countries. You think some uppity—" He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but the word hung in the air like poison gas. Everyone in the lounge heard what he'd almost said. Everyone understood exactly what he meant. Victoria's expression didn't change, but her thumb moved slightly closer to the red icon on her phone screen. "Finish that sentence, Bradford. Please. I want to make sure my lawyer gets it all on record." "Your lawyer," Bradford scoffed. "What are you going to do, sue me for hurt feelings? Do you have any idea how many lawyers I have on retainer? How many judges I play golf with?" From across the lounge, Dr. Maria Santos looked up from her medical journal. As a neurosurgeon at Mount Sinai Hospital, she'd learned to recognize when situations were about to spiral out of control. This felt like watching someone ignore warning signs before a massive stroke. Near the window, Judge Robert Kim set down his coffee with the deliberate precision of someone who had just witnessed something that would require careful documentation. As a federal judge with 30 years on the bench, he'd seen enough discrimination cases to recognize when someone was building a legal case in real time. Lisa Anderson, an investment banker with Morgan Stanley, whispered to her colleague, "I think I know who that woman is. If I'm right, Bradford just made the worst mistake of his life." Victoria glanced around the lounge, noting the growing audience, the phones being discreetly aimed in her direction. The staff members who were starting to look uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Carmen," she said, her voice carrying across the space with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'd like you to call your supervisor, please." Carmen hesitated, looking between Victoria and Bradford like a child caught between arguing parents. "Ma'am, I don't think that's necessary. We can sort this out without involving—" "Call your supervisor," Victoria repeated, and this time there was steel beneath the silk. "Because in approximately 3 minutes, this situation is going to escalate beyond your pay grade, and you're going to want management here to handle the fallout." Bradford stepped closer to Victoria, invading her personal space with the aggressive posture of a man who had never been told no by someone he considered inferior. "You want to escalate, fine. Let's escalate. I spend more money with this airline in a month than you make in a year. I have their CEO on speed dial. One phone call from me and you'll be banned from flying anywhere on any airline for the rest of your life." Victoria looked up at him completely unimpressed by his physical intimidation tactics. "One phone call, you say? What an interesting coincidence." She held up her phone thumb, still hovering over the red icon. "I was just about to make a phone call myself." The lounge fell silent, except for the distant sound of jets taxiing on the runway outside. Even the background music seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Bradford's confidence wavered for just a moment. "What kind of phone call?" Victoria smiled, and for the first time since entering the lounge, she looked genuinely happy. "The kind that answers your question about who my boss is." She pressed the icon. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, a crisp male voice answered. "Arthur speaking. How can I help you?" Victoria kept her eyes locked on Bradford as she spoke. "Arthur, I need you to pull the files on Ashworth Properties. All of them. Focus on the loan agreements, especially the personal conduct clauses in Bradford Ashworth's personal guarantees." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Should I ask why Mr. Ashworth is currently providing a live demonstration of why those clauses exist?" Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent lounge. "I want full documentation, ready for legal review within the hour." Bradford's face had gone from red to pale in the span of 30 seconds. "Who are you calling? Who is Arthur?" Victoria ended the call and slipped her phone back into her bag. "Arthur Clemens, Chief Financial Officer of Montech Financial. Perhaps you've heard of us." The name hit Bradford like a physical blow. Montech Financial wasn't just any fintech company. It was the fintech company, the one that processed billions in transactions daily, the one that had quietly become the backbone of modern banking infrastructure. And if this woman was calling their CFO by his first name, "That's impossible," Bradford said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You can't be. You're not." "CEO and founder," Victoria confirmed. 20% market share in mobile banking, $15 billion in assets under management. And according to my last conversation with your accounting firm, we hold approximately $847 million in outstanding debt obligations from Ashworth Properties. Carmen Rodriguez felt the blood drain from her face. She'd just spent 20 minutes treating the CEO of Montech Financial like a shoplifter in Nordstrom. Her hands started shaking as she reached for her desk phone. Michael Thompson moved closer to the front desk, no longer content to observe from the sidelines. "Ma'am," he said to Victoria, his military bearing evident in his posture. "I apologize for how you've been treated. This is unacceptable behavior from our staff and our guests." Bradford whirled on Michael with fury that came from a lifetime of never being contradicted by service workers. "Stay in your lane, waiter. Nobody asked for your opinion." "It's not an opinion," Michael replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "It's an observation. I've been watching this interaction for 20 minutes, and what I've observed is discrimination, harassment, and threats. Ma'am," he said, turning back to Victoria, "would you like me to call airport security?" James Parker's live stream had exploded to over 200,000 viewers, and the comments were coming so fast they were just a blur of outrage and anticipation. Justice at JFK was trending nationwide, and other social media influencers were picking up the story. This wasn't just about discrimination anymore. This was about power privilege and what happened when someone pushed back. Dr. Maria Santos approached the group, her medical bag in hand and her expression serious. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing this conversation, and I feel compelled to say something." Bradford turned his attention to her, assuming he'd found an ally. Dr. Santos was well-dressed, well-spoken, and appeared to be exactly the kind of person who belonged in spaces like the Crown Lounge. "Thank you," Bradford said, relief evident in his voice. Finally, someone with some sense. Tell this woman that there are certain standards. Mr. Ashworth, Dr. Santos, interrupted her voice, carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to life and death decisions. I'm a neurosurgeon at Mount Sinai Hospital. I've spent my career working with people who have suffered trauma, often trauma caused by stress, discrimination, and harassment. She paused, looking directly at Bradford with the clinical assessment of a doctor examining a patient. What I'm witnessing here is textbook discriminatory behavior. You've made assumptions based on race, dismissed valid credentials, used intimidation tactics, and threatened retaliation. If this woman were my patient, I'd be documenting this incident as a clear case of discriminatory harassment. Bradford's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You don't understand the situation. I understand perfectly, Dr. Santos continued. I understand that you've judged someone based on their appearance rather than their qualifications. I understand that you've used your perceived status to intimidate airport staff. And I understand that you're about to face consequences for that behavior. Judge Robert Kim had been taking notes on his phone throughout the entire interaction. As a federal judge, he'd presided over dozens of discrimination cases, and he recognized the legal implications of what he was witnessing. Ma'am, he said to Victoria, approaching with the measured dignity of someone who understood the weight of justice. I'm Federal Judge Robert Kim. I want you to know that if you choose to pursue legal action regarding this incident, I'd be happy to provide a witness statement documenting what I've observed here today. Bradford stared at Judge Kim with growing horror. A federal judge, a neurosurgeon, an airline employee willing to contradict company policy, Victoria Monroe herself. Every witness in the lounge was lining up against him, and for the first time in his life, Bradford Ashworth III realized he might be completely outgunned. Lisa Anderson, the investment banker, couldn't stay quiet any longer. Mr. Ashworth, I work at Morgan Stanley. We've done business with Montech Financial on multiple occasions. If Ms. Monroe is who she says she is, and I believe she is, then you've just threatened one of the most powerful women in American finance. She paused, checking her phone where Montech's stock price was displayed in real time. And judging by the way Montech's stock is moving right now, the market is starting to notice. Carmen Rodriguez finally found her voice. Ms. Monroe, I sincerely apologize for how I treated you. I made assumptions that were wrong and unprofessional. I take full responsibility for my actions. Bradford looked around the lounge with growing panic. Every face that had been neutral or supportive 30 minutes ago was now looking at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. The social dynamic had shifted completely, and he was no longer the king of his castle. He was the villain in someone else's story. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising to a near shout. You're all being manipulated. This woman probably isn't even who she says she is. Anyone can claim to be a CEO. Anyone can make phone calls. Victoria reached into her bag again and withdrew a business card. Simple black cardstock with white lettering. No fancy logos or embossed designs, just her name, title, and contact information. She handed it to Carmen, who examined it with the careful attention of someone looking at evidence in a criminal trial. Victoria Monroe, Chief Executive Officer, Montech Financial. Carmen read aloud. Direct line to the CEO's office. Bradford grabbed the card from Carmen's hands, studying it with desperate intensity. Business cards can be faked. This proves nothing. Elena Vasquez had been watching the situation unfold from her position near the security desk. As chief of airport security for Terminal 5, Elena had seen her share of altercations, but this one felt different. The usual airport disputes were about missed flights or overbooked seats. This was about something much deeper. Elena approached the group with the measured pace of someone who understood that every step mattered. She was 35 years old, a former NYPD detective who had transitioned to airport security after a decade of street policing. She knew how to read situations, how to identify threats, and how to de-escalate conflicts before they exploded into violence. "Good afternoon, everyone," Elena said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. "I'm Elena Vasquez, Chief of Airport Security. I've been monitoring this situation, and I think it's time for everyone to take a step back." Bradford immediately turned to Elena with relief, assuming that security would support his position. "Thank God. Officer, this woman has been harassing legitimate passengers and making fraudulent claims about her identity. I need her removed from the lounge immediately." Elena looked at Bradford with the flat, unimpressed expression of someone who had heard every con, every lie, and every manipulation tactic in the book. "Mr. Ashworth, I've been watching this interaction through our security cameras for the past 30 minutes. Based on what I've observed, the only person who has been harassing anyone is you." She turned to Victoria with a respectful nod. "Ms. Monroe, I apologize for the treatment you've received here today. This kind of behavior is unacceptable in our terminal, and we will be conducting a full investigation." Years believing that money and status could solve any problem, and he wasn't about to give up now. "Fine," he said, pulling out his own phone with shaking hands. "You want to play games? I'll call the airline CEO right now. I'll have all of you fired before this plane takes off." Victoria watched Bradford dial with the detached interest of a scientist observing a laboratory experiment. She knew exactly what was about to happen, because she knew exactly who Bradford was trying to call. David Martinez, Regional Vice President of Operations, answered Bradford's call on the second ring. "Mr. Ashworth, how can I help you today?" Bradford's voice took on the imperious tone of someone accustomed to having his problems solved immediately. "David, I'm in the Crown Lounge right now, and your staff is completely out of control. There's a woman here making fraudulent claims, harassing passengers, and your security chief is taking her side. I need everyone involved fired immediately." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Ashworth, could you describe the woman you're talking about? Black mid-30s, wearing casual clothes, claims to be some kind of CEO, obviously lying about her status to gain access to first class. Your people should have removed her 20 minutes ago." Another pause. Longer this time. "Mr. Ashworth, are you talking about Victoria Monroe?" Bradford's confidence faltered. "You know who she is. Sir Victoria Monroe is the CEO of Montech Financial, one of our largest corporate partners. If you've been harassing Ms. Monroe, this is a very serious situation." The phone slipped from Bradford's hand, clattering against the marble floor with a sound like breaking glass. Every eye in the lounge was on him now, and for the first time in his privileged life, Bradford Ashworth III realized that money and status weren't enough to protect him from the consequences of his actions. Victoria picked up Bradford's phone and handed it back to him with a gesture that was almost gentle. "David," she said loud enough for everyone in the lounge to hear. "This is Victoria. I think we need to have a conversation." The silence in the Crown Lounge was deafening. Bradford Ashworth stood frozen, his expensive phone trembling in his manicured hands as the full weight of his situation began to dawn on him. Victoria Monroe, the woman he had dismissed as an imposter, was speaking directly to David Martinez, one of the most powerful executives in commercial aviation. "David, I'm standing in your Crown Lounge right now, and I've just experienced 45 minutes of discrimination from both your staff and one of your passengers," Victoria said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who was accustomed to having powerful people hang on her every word. Through the phone speaker, David Martinez's voice was clearly audible to everyone in the lounge. "Ms. Monroe, I am deeply sorry about this situation. Please tell me exactly what happened, and I will personally ensure that it's addressed immediately." Victoria looked around the lounge, making eye contact with each person who had witnessed the confrontation. Carmen Rodriguez looked like she was about to faint. Michael Thompson stood at attention as if he were still in the military. Dr. Santos, Judge Kim, and Lisa Anderson watched with the fascination of people witnessing a master class in power dynamics. James Parker's live stream had reached 500,000 viewers, and the hashtag #MonTechMeltdown was trending globally. Comments were flooding in from people sharing their own experiences with discrimination, expressing support for Victoria, and demanding consequences for Bradford's behavior. David. Victoria continued, I think it would be more productive to handle this conversation in person. Could you join us in the Crown Lounge? I believe you'll want to hear from the witnesses directly. I'm on my way, Martinez replied immediately. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Victoria ended the call and handed the phone back to Bradford, who accepted it with the shell-shocked expression of someone who had just survived a car accident but wasn't sure if he was actually okay. Mr. Ashworth Victoria said, her tone surprisingly gentle. You have approximately 10 minutes to decide how you want this situation to end. You can apologize sincerely, acknowledge your mistake, and try to rebuild some semblance of dignity. Or you can continue to deny reality and face the full consequences of your actions. Bradford's mind raced through his options like a computer processing a complex equation. His first instinct was to double down to maintain his position and fight his way out of this situation through pure force of will and financial pressure. That approach had worked for him for 52 years. But looking around the lounge, seeing the faces of the witnesses, feeling the weight of James Parker's camera capturing every moment for hundreds of thousands of viewers, Bradford realized that his usual tactics might not work this time. I don't understand, he stammered, his usual confidence completely shattered. You're really the CEO of Montech, but you don't look like what you expected. Victoria finished his sentence with a slight smile. Let me help you understand something, Bradford. I built Montech Financial from nothing. I didn't inherit it from my father or grandfather. I didn't buy my way into the CEO's office with family money. I earned it. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. I started with a laptop and an idea. I worked 18-hour days for 15 years. I revolutionized how financial services work for the people who need them most. And yes, I did it all while looking exactly like this. Bradford's phone started buzzing with incoming calls. He glanced at the screen and saw names that made his blood run cold. His accountant, his lawyer, his business partner, his wife. With shaking fingers, he answered his accountant's call. Bradford, we have a problem, the voice said without preamble. Montech Financial just activated acceleration clauses on all your outstanding debt. They're calling in everything. $900 million due immediately. Bradford felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. That's impossible. Those loans aren't due for 2 years. They are if you violate the personal conduct clauses in your guarantee agreements. Bradford, what did you do? He looked at Victoria, who was watching him with the detached interest of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. She had triggered this. Somehow, some way, she had just destroyed his entire financial structure with a single phone call. How Bradford whispered, his voice barely audible. How did you know about my loans? Victoria reached into her bag and withdrew a tablet, swiping through screens with the fluid efficiency of someone who lived in the digital world. Montech Financial provides the processing infrastructure for 70% of commercial real estate lending in Manhattan. When you borrowed $900 million to expand into the Miami market, those loans were packaged, securitized, and sold through our trading platform. She turned the tablet screen toward Bradford, showing a complex web of financial relationships that connected his company to dozens of institutions, all of which ultimately flowed through Montech's networks. In simple terms, Bradford, I own your debt. All of it. And when you signed those personal guarantee agreements, you agreed to certain standards of personal conduct. Discrimination, harassment, and public behavior that damages the reputation of the lending institutions are all grounds for immediate acceleration. Bradford's phone continued buzzing. His business partner, his construction foreman, his property managers. Each call brought worse news as the financial house of cards he had built began collapsing in real time. Carmen Rodriguez had retreated behind the reception desk, frantically typing on her computer as she tried to understand the magnitude of what she had just witnessed. Michael Thompson approached Victoria with the careful respect of someone who realized he was standing in the presence of true power. "Ms. Monroe," Michael said, "I want to apologize personally for how you were treated here today. This kind of behavior goes against everything we're supposed to represent as an airline." Victoria turned her attention to Michael with a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you, Michael. I appreciate your honesty and your willingness to speak up." That took courage. Elena Vasquez had been quietly coordinating with her security team through her radio, and now she approached the group with an update. "Ms. Monroe, I've spoken with my superiors, and we want you to know that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. We have complete camera coverage of everything that happened, and will be implementing additional training protocols to prevent this kind of situation in the future." Dr. Santos stepped forward, her medical training evident in her approach to problem solving. "Ms. Monroe, as a witness to this incident, I want to make sure you know that you have strong grounds for legal action if you choose to pursue it. The discrimination you experienced was blatant and well documented." Judge Kim nodded in agreement. "As a federal judge, I can confirm that Mr. Ashworth's behavior would constitute clear violations of several civil rights statutes. The combination of racial discrimination, harassment, and intimidation in a public accommodation creates potential liability under multiple federal laws." Lisa Anderson had been furiously typing on her phone throughout the conversation, and now she looked up with an expression of amazement. Ms. Monroe Montec's stock price just jumped 12% in the last 30 minutes. The market is interpreting your actions as a demonstration of strength and decisive leadership. Your company's market cap just increased by almost $2 billion. Bradford overheard this and felt another wave of nausea wash over him. Not only had his own company been financially destroyed, but Victoria's company was actually benefiting from the situation. The universe seemed to be rewarding her for destroying him. James Parker had been providing running commentary to his live stream audience throughout the entire confrontation, and now he addressed his camera directly. Folks were witnessing something unprecedented here. This isn't just about discrimination in the airline industry. This is about power accountability and what happens when someone finally fights back against prejudice that has protected people like Bradford Ashworth for way too long. The comments on his live stream were exploding with support for Victoria and condemnation for Bradford. Victory. For Victoria was trending alongside #Ashworth downfall, and major news outlets were starting to pick up the story. Bradford's wife called. With trembling hands, he answered the phone. "Bradford, what have you done?" "Melissa." Ashworth's voice was sharp with panic. "Our financial advisor just called. He says we're ruined. He says you've lost everything." Bradford looked at Victoria, who was now surrounded by supporters and witnesses, all of them documenting his downfall in real time. "I made a mistake, Mel. I made a terrible mistake." "What kind of mistake cost $900 million? Bradford couldn't find the words to explain how his entire world had collapsed because he couldn't treat a black woman with basic human dignity. How his assumptions about race and class had led him to harass someone who controlled his financial future. How a lifetime of privilege had made him so arrogant that he'd destroyed himself in 45 minutes. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered into the phone. Victoria heard his words and approached him with an expression that was neither victorious nor cruel. She looked like someone who had just taught a very expensive lesson. "Bradford," she said quietly, "there's only one way to fix this. You need to understand what you did wrong, acknowledge it publicly, and commit to changing your behavior permanently." She gestured toward the witnesses, the cameras, the evidence of his humiliation. "But first, you need to apologize. Not to me necessarily, but to everyone you've hurt with your assumptions and prejudices. And you need to mean it." Bradford looked around the lounge one more time, seeing his reflection in the disappointed faces of people who had witnessed his complete moral failure. For the first time in his life, he understood that money couldn't buy him out of this situation. Status couldn't protect him from consequences. And all the privilege in the world couldn't save him from the judgment of people who had seen his true character. The Crown Lounge had become his courtroom, and the verdict was already in. The Crown Lounge had transformed from an exclusive sanctuary into a public tribunal, with Bradford Ashworth III standing trial in front of an audience that was growing by the minute. David Martinez burst through the lounge doors exactly 9 minutes after Victoria's call, his usual composed executive demeanor replaced by the urgent concern of someone who understood that his company's reputation was hanging in the balance. David was 48 years old, a 20-year veteran of the airline industry, who had worked his way up from baggage handler to regional vice president through a combination of intelligence, integrity, and an absolute intolerance for discrimination. His own family had immigrated from Mexico when he was 12, and he had experienced enough prejudice to recognize it instantly. Ms. Monroe David said, approaching Victoria with the respectful urgency of someone addressing a head of state. "I cannot express how sorry I am about this situation. This is completely unacceptable behavior from our staff and absolutely does not represent the values of our airline." Bradford watched this interaction with growing desperation. He had expected David to support him to side with a valuable customer against some unknown troublemaker. Instead, David was treating Victoria like visiting royalty while barely acknowledging Bradford's existence. Victoria nodded graciously to David. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Martinez, but I think it's important that you hear from the witnesses about what actually happened here today." David turned to Carmen Rodriguez, who looked like she was preparing for her own execution. "Carmen, I need you to tell me exactly what transpired." Carmen's voice shook as she began her account. Ms. Monroe approached the desk with a valid first-class ticket to Geneva. I looked at her and assumed she was in the wrong place. I directed her to the business class lounge because I thought she didn't belong here." The words hung in the air like an admission of guilt. Carmen continued, her voice getting stronger as she forced herself to confront her own actions. "Mr. Ashworth arrived and supported my assumption. He made comments about Ms. Monroe's appearance, suggested she didn't look like she belonged in first class, and threatened to have her removed from the airport entirely." David's expression grew darker with each word. "And what did you do when Mr. Ashworth made these comments?" "I supported him," Carmen said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "I called for security because I believed him instead of checking Ms. Monroe's credentials properly. I discriminated against a passenger based on her race, and I'm deeply ashamed of my actions." Michael Thompson stepped forward. "David, I witnessed the entire interaction. Mr. Ashworth made explicitly discriminatory comments, used intimidation tactics, and threatened retaliation against Miss Monroe and the staff. His behavior was completely unacceptable." Bradford's phone had been ringing continuously throughout this conversation, and now he answered another call with the mechanical movements of someone in shock. "Bradford, this is Jennifer from the Times." The voice of the financial reporter was crisp and professional. "We're running a story about Montech Financial's acceleration of your debt obligations. Would you like to comment on the circumstances that led to this action?" Bradford looked around the lounge, seeing cameras witnessing faces and evidence of his public humiliation being broadcast to the world. No comment, he managed to whisper before ending the call. James Parker's live stream had reached 1 million viewers, making it one of the most watched real-time events in social media history. The comments were coming so fast they were just a blur of support for Victoria and condemnation for Bradford's behavior. "Ladies and gentlemen," James said to his camera, "we're witnessing something that will be talked about for years to come. This is what accountability looks like in real time." Lisa Anderson had been monitoring the financial markets on her phone, and now she looked up with an expression of amazement. "The ripple effects are already spreading through the market. Ashworth Properties stock is in free fall, down 60% in the last hour. Their corporate bonds are being downgraded as we speak. Dr. Santos approached Bradford with the clinical concern of a physician examining a patient in crisis. Mr. Ashworth, you appear to be in shock. I'm concerned about your blood pressure and heart rate. Do you need medical attention? Bradford looked at her with the hollow eyes of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. I need to understand how this happened. How did one conversation destroy everything I built? Victoria overheard his question and decided to provide an answer. Bradford, you didn't lose everything because of one conversation. You lost everything because of a lifetime of conversations like this one. The only difference is that today there were consequences. She gestured toward the witnesses and cameras surrounding them. Every assumption you made about me was based on prejudice. Every comment you made was rooted in discrimination. Every threat you issued was an abuse of perceived power. This isn't about one mistake. This is about a pattern of behavior that finally caught up with you. Elena Vasquez had been coordinating with airport management, and now she approached David Martinez with an update. Sir, we've reviewed the security footage from the past hour. Everything that's been reported is confirmed on camera. Mr. Ashworth's behavior clearly violated our passenger conduct policies. David nodded grimly. Elena, I want Mr. Ashworth escorted from the premises and banned from this terminal pending a full investigation. His behavior is unacceptable. Bradford's remaining composure finally cracked. Banned? You can't ban me. Do you know how much money I spend with this airline? I'm a Diamond Medallion member. I have rights. Your rights ended when you chose to discriminate against another passenger. David replied firmly. Ms. Monroe has rights too, and we failed to protect them. That ends now. Judge Kim had been taking detailed notes throughout the entire incident, and now he approached Victoria with the measured dignity of someone who understood the legal implications of what had transpired. Ms. Monroe, as a federal judge, I want you to know that you have strong grounds for civil rights action under several federal statutes. The pattern of discrimination you experienced today was clear, well documented, and witnessed by multiple people. Victoria nodded gratefully. Thank you. Your Honor, I'm considering all of my legal options. Bradford's lawyer called. With shaking hands, he answered the phone. Bradford. This is catastrophic, the voice said without preamble. Montech Financial has legal grounds to accelerate your debt based on the conduct clauses you signed. We're looking at potential bankruptcy, asset seizure, and personal liability that could extend to your family's holdings. Bradford felt the last of his strength drain away. Can you fix it? Not unless you can convince Victoria Monroe to reverse her decision. And based on what I'm seeing on social media, that seems unlikely. The social media storm was indeed intensifying. #justice at JFK had been shared millions of times, with celebrities, politicians, and activists weighing in on the situation. The video of Bradford's discriminatory comments was being analyzed frame by frame, with experts discussing the psychology of prejudice and the importance of accountability. Victoria's phone rang, and she answered with the calm professionalism that had characterized her behavior throughout the entire ordeal. Victoria, this is Senator Williams. The voice belonged to the chairwoman of the Senate Banking Committee. I've been following the situation at JFK, and I want you to know that you have my full support. This kind of discrimination has no place in American business. Bradford overheard this conversation and realized that the consequences of his actions were extending far beyond his personal financial situation. Political figures were taking sides, and they weren't taking his. Dr. Santos approached Victoria with a medical perspective on what she had witnessed. Ms. Monroe, what you did today was remarkable. You faced discrimination with dignity, responded to threats with strength, and used your power responsibly. That takes incredible emotional intelligence and self-control. Victoria smiled slightly. Thank you, Doctor. I learned long ago that anger is expensive and dignity is priceless. Carmen Rodriguez had been quietly crying at her desk, and now she approached Victoria with the hesitant steps of someone seeking forgiveness she wasn't sure she deserved. Ms. Monroe, I know I have no right to ask this, but I want you to know how sorry I am. I was wrong, completely wrong, and I take full responsibility for my actions. I discriminated against you, and there's no excuse for that. Victoria looked at Carmen with an expression that was neither forgiving nor condemning. Carmen, apologies are a start, but they're not enough. The question is what you're going to do differently going forward. Michael Thompson stepped up beside Carmen. Ms. Monroe, both Carmen and I want to be part of the solution. We want to help make sure this never happens to anyone else. Elena Vasquez had finished coordinating with airport security and now returned with an update for David Martinez. Sir, we're ready to escort Mr. Ashworth from the terminal. His access privileges have been revoked pending the investigation. Bradford looked around the lounge one final time, seeing the faces of people who had witnessed his complete moral failure. The federal judge taking notes. The neurosurgeon who had condemned his behavior. The investment banker who had documented his financial collapse. The airline employees who had finally found the courage to stand up to him. And Victoria Monroe, the woman whose dignity he had tried to destroy, standing calm and composed while his entire world burned around him. This isn't over, Bradford said weakly, though everyone in the room could tell he no longer believed his own words. Victoria looked at him with something that might have been pity. You're right, Bradford. It's not over. The consequences of your actions will follow you for years. But that's your choice. You could have chosen dignity over prejudice, respect over discrimination, humility over arrogance. Instead, you chose to judge me by the color of my skin rather than the content of my character. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Now you get to live with that choice. As airport security escorted Bradford Ashworth III from the Crown Lounge, his empire in ruins and his reputation destroyed, Victoria Monroe finally approached the gate for her flight to Geneva. The Swiss National Bank governors were waiting for her, unaware that she had just provided the world with a masterclass in power, dignity, and justice. The Crown Lounge slowly returned to its normal operations, but everyone present knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. James Parker ended his live stream with a simple message. Justice doesn't always come from courtrooms or legislation. Sometimes it comes from people with the courage to stand up and the power to back it up. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The video of Bradford Ashworth's public humiliation and Victoria Monroe's dignified response spread across the internet like wildfire, reaching 50 million views within 24 hours. News networks picked up the story. Social media influencers analyzed every moment, and corporate boardrooms across America began emergency meetings to review their own discrimination policies. Victoria's flight to Geneva proceeded without incident, but her phone never stopped ringing. Interview requests from major network, statements of support from civil rights organizations, and inquiries from corporations wanting to partner with Montech Financial flooded her inbox. She had become more than just a successful CEO. She had become a symbol of dignity under fire and accountability in action. 3 days after the incident, Victoria sat in the boardroom of the Swiss National Bank, having successfully negotiated a landmark agreement that would revolutionize European mobile banking. But even in the sophisticated halls of Swiss finance, the conversation kept returning to what had happened at JFK. Ms. Monroe said Dr. Heinrich Müller, the bank's chairman, "Your handling of that unfortunate situation in New York has been quite remarkable. You demonstrated the kind of principled leadership that the financial world desperately needs." Victoria nodded graciously. "Thank you, Dr. Müller. I believe that how we handle adversity reveals more about our character than how we handle success." Meanwhile, back in New York, the airline industry was experiencing its own reckoning. David Martinez had called an emergency meeting of all regional executives, and the topic was comprehensive policy reform. What happened in our Crown Lounge cannot happen again, David told the assembled executives, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that their company's reputation hung in the balance. We're implementing immediate changes to our customer service protocols, bias training requirements, and accountability measures. The changes were swift and comprehensive. All customer-facing employees would undergo monthly bias training. Customer service interactions would be randomly monitored for discriminatory behavior. Independent oversight committees would review discrimination complaints. And most importantly, employees would be empowered and required to intervene when they witnessed discriminatory behavior from staff or passengers. Carmen Rodriguez found herself at the center of this transformation. Rather than being simply fired for her role in the incident, she was asked to help develop the new training protocols based on her first-hand experience with unconscious bias. I want to understand what I was thinking, Carmen said during a training session with other airport employees. I want to understand how I could look at a successful businesswoman and see only stereotypes. If I can understand my own prejudice, maybe I can help others recognize theirs. Michael Thompson became a case study in moral courage. His willingness to speak up against discrimination, even when it put his job at risk, was held up as an example of the kind of behavior the airline wanted to encourage. He was promoted to training supervisor responsible for implementing the new bias awareness programs across all terminal locations. The ripple effects extended far beyond the airline industry. Corporate America was paying attention to what had happened to Bradford Ashworth, and executives across the country were quietly reviewing their own behavior and company policies. At Ashworth Properties, the collapse was total and immediate. Without Bradford's leadership and with their credit lines frozen, the company filed for bankruptcy within a week. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs and dozens of construction projects ground to a halt. The family name that had been synonymous with New York real estate for 3 generations was permanently tarnished. Bradford himself had become a pariah in the business community. Country club memberships were revoked. Business partnerships dissolved overnight. Social invitations stopped arriving. He discovered that the network of relationships he had spent decades building was actually quite shallow when it wasn't supported by money and status. His wife, Melissa, filed for divorce 3 weeks after the incident. Their children, horrified by the viral video of their father's behavior, legally changed their last names and released public statements distancing themselves from his actions. "We were raised to believe that success gave us the right to look down on others," his eldest daughter told a reporter. "What happened at JFK showed us how wrong we were and how wrong our father has been for his entire life." But the most significant changes were happening in corporate boardrooms across America. Companies were reviewing their policies, their hiring practices, and their corporate cultures with a new urgency. The phrase personal conduct clauses became common in executive contracts as corporations realized they needed legal tools to address discriminatory behavior from their leaders. Victoria Monroe found herself at the center of this transformation. She was invited to testify before Congress about discrimination in financial services, asked to speak at corporate leadership conferences, and sought out by companies wanting to improve their diversity and inclusion efforts. The Ashworth incident wasn't an anomaly. Victoria told a Senate subcommittee investigating discrimination in financial services. It was a window into patterns of behavior that exist throughout American business. The only difference was that this time there were consequences. Senator Williams, the chairwoman of the Banking Committee, leaned forward with interest. "Ms. Monroe, what would you say to executives who claim they've never seen discriminatory behavior in their organizations?" Victoria's response was measured but firm. "I would say they're not looking hard enough. Discrimination doesn't usually announce itself with explicit slurs or obvious harassment. It's more often found in assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces, who gets the benefit of the doubt, and who is required to prove their worthiness repeatedly." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Bradford Ashworth didn't think he was being discriminatory. He thought he was maintaining standards. The problem is that his standards were based on prejudice rather than merit. The congressional hearing was broadcast live and generated millions of views online. Victoria's calm, intelligent testimony helped educate the public about the subtle ways that discrimination operated in professional settings. Judge Robert Kim had been following the aftermath of the JFK incident closely, and he used his position on the federal bench to advocate for stronger enforcement of civil rights laws in public accommodations. The Monroe case demonstrates that discrimination in public facilities remains a serious problem, Judge Kim wrote in a legal opinion that was widely circulated among his judicial colleagues. We need stronger enforcement mechanisms and clearer consequences for both individual and institutional discrimination. Dr. Maria Santos had her own platform for change. As a respected neurosurgeon, she spoke at medical conferences about the psychological impact of discrimination on both victims and witnesses. What I observed at JFK was traumatic for everyone involved, Dr. Santos told a gathering of healthcare professionals. Discrimination doesn't just harm the target. It creates a toxic environment that affects everyone who witnesses it. Healthcare professionals need to understand these dynamics and be prepared to intervene when we see discriminatory behavior. Lisa Anderson used her position at Morgan Stanley to advocate for stronger diversity and inclusion measures in the financial services industry. She had witnessed firsthand how quickly assumptions about race and class could lead to catastrophic business decisions. Bradford Ashworth lost $900 million because he couldn't see past his own prejudices, Lisa told her colleagues at a firm-wide meeting. That's not just morally wrong, it's bad business. We need to examine our own biases and make sure we're making decisions based on facts rather than stereotypes. James Parker's documentary about the incident, titled Dignity at 35,000 Feet, won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Investigative Journalism. The film used the JFK confrontation as a launching point for a broader examination of discrimination in travel and hospitality industries. What made Victoria Monroe's response so powerful wasn't just that she had the financial resources to fight back, James said during his Emmy acceptance speech. It was that she maintained her dignity throughout the entire ordeal. She showed us that you can stand up to discrimination without sacrificing your principles. The Monroe Foundation, established with a $100 million endowment, became a major force for civil rights advocacy and corporate accountability. The foundation provided legal support for discrimination victims, funded bias training programs, and established scholarship programs for underrepresented students pursuing careers in business and finance. Elena Vasquez was promoted to a national position overseeing anti-discrimination training for airport security personnel across the country. Her experience handling the JFK incident had demonstrated the importance of having security professionals who understood the legal and ethical implications of discriminatory behavior. Airport security officers are often the first responders to discrimination incidents, Elena explained during a training session for federal air marshals. We need to be prepared to protect passengers' civil rights, not just their physical safety. The changes extended to the highest levels of corporate leadership. CEOs across America began implementing what became known as Monroe Standards, comprehensive policies requiring respectful treatment of all customers regardless of appearance, background, or perceived status. These standards included mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees, regular monitoring of customer service interactions, clear escalation procedures for discrimination complaints, and most importantly, protection for employees who reported or intervened in discriminatory situations. The airline industry, in particular, underwent a comprehensive transformation. The International Air Transport Association established new guidelines for passenger treatment, and airlines began sharing best practices for preventing discrimination. The Monroe incident was a wake-up call for our entire industry, said the IATA's Director General during a press conference. We realized that we had been tolerating behavior that was not only morally wrong but also legally problematic and bad for business. The financial services industry also took notice. Banking regulators began requiring financial institutions to report discrimination complaints and implement comprehensive bias training programs. The Monroe Standards became a model for how financial companies could protect both their customers and their reputations. Victoria herself became a sought-after speaker and consultant, helping organizations understand how unconscious bias could lead to both ethical failures and business disasters. But she was careful to emphasize that the goal wasn't just avoiding negative consequences. The objective isn't just to prevent the next Bradford Ashworth situation, Victoria told a gathering of Fortune 500 CEOs. The objective is to create organizations where dignity and respect are so deeply embedded in the culture that discrimination becomes impossible. 6 months after the JFK incident, the transformation was visible across American business. Discrimination complaints were being taken more seriously. Training programs were more comprehensive, and most importantly, employees felt empowered to speak up when they witnessed discriminatory behavior. But perhaps the most significant change was in the broader cultural conversation about power, privilege, and accountability. The Ashworth incident had demonstrated that actions have consequences, that dignity is non-negotiable, and that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is simply refusing to tolerate it. The story had become more than just an airline incident. It had become a cultural touchstone for anyone who had ever been judged by their appearance rather than their character, and a reminder that justice, when it finally arrives, can be swift and complete. 6 months after the incident that destroyed Bradford Ashworth's empire and elevated Victoria Monroe to national prominence, an unexpected phone call would change both of their lives once more. Victoria was in her Manhattan headquarters, a gleaming tower overlooking Central Park, when her assistant informed her that Bradford Ashworth was requesting a meeting. "He's persistent," Ms. Monroe Arthur Clemens said, reviewing the requests that had come in over the past several weeks. "He's called 17 times, written 6 letters, and even showed up at the building lobby twice. Security turned him away, but he keeps trying." Victoria looked out at Central Park, where autumn leaves were painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of congressional testimony, media interviews, and corporate consulting engagements. She had become the face of dignity under fire, the CEO who had stood up to discrimination and won. But winning, she had discovered, felt different than she had expected. Bradford Ashworth's complete destruction had been swift and total, but it hadn't brought her the satisfaction she thought it would. Justice had been served, but justice without redemption felt somehow incomplete. "What does he want?" Victoria asked. "He says he wants to apologize. Really apologize. He's been attending bias training sessions, working with civil rights organizations, and apparently he's been volunteering at a community center in Queens teaching financial literacy to low-income families." Victoria raised an eyebrow. Bradford Ashworth volunteering in Queens was not something she could have imagined 6 months ago. Is he looking for some kind of mercy, trying to negotiate a reduction in his debt obligations? He specifically said he wasn't asking for any financial consideration. He just wants to apologize and to ask if there's any way he can help prevent others from making the same mistakes he made. Victoria considered this for a long moment. Bradford's complete downfall had sent shockwaves through corporate America, but it had also generated criticism from some quarters that the punishment had been disproportionate to the crime. She had received letters from people arguing that everyone deserved a second chance, that redemption should be possible, even for someone who had behaved as badly as Bradford. "Set up a meeting," Victoria said finally. "But not here. I want to see what he's been doing in Queens first." The Hamilton Community Center in Queens was a world away from the marble lobbies and crystal chandeliers of Manhattan's financial district. The building was older, with linoleum floors and fluorescent lighting, but it buzzed with activity and purpose. Children attended after-school programs, seniors played chess and shared meals, and adults took classes in everything from English as a second language to computer skills. Victoria arrived unannounced on a Thursday evening, dressed in the same simple style that had characterized her appearance at JFK 6 months earlier. She asked the receptionist about financial literacy classes and was directed to a classroom down the hall. Through the open doorway, she could see Bradford Ashworth standing in front of a whiteboard explaining the basics of credit scores to a group of 20 adults. Victoria almost didn't recognize him. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by khakis and a polo shirt. The arrogant posture had been replaced by something that looked like humility. And, most striking of all, the condescending tone that had characterized his speech at JFK was nowhere to be heard. Credit scores seem mysterious, but they're really just a measure of how reliably you pay your debts, Bradford was explaining to his students. The system is designed to help lenders assess risk, but understanding how it works can help you improve your score and access better financial opportunities. An elderly Hispanic woman raised her hand. "Mr. Bradford, my daughter says I should get a credit card to build credit, but I'm scared of debt. What should I do?" Bradford's response was patient and thoughtful. "That's a very reasonable fear, Mrs. Gonzalez. Debt can be dangerous if it's not managed properly. Let's talk about secured credit cards, which allow you to build credit without the risk of overspending." Victoria listened for 20 minutes as Bradford fielded questions with genuine respect and apparent expertise. His students clearly trusted him and valued his advice. This was not the same man who had tried to humiliate her in the Crown Lounge 6 months earlier. When the class ended, Victoria waited in the hallway as students filed out, many of them stopping to thank Bradford for his help. When the last student had left, Victoria stepped into the doorway. Bradford looked up and froze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Bradford slowly stood up, his expression cycling through surprise, shame, and something that might have been hope. "Ms. Monroe," he said quietly, I didn't expect to see you here." "I wanted to understand what you've been doing," Victoria replied, stepping into the classroom and looking around at the simple surroundings. "Your CFO told me you've been trying to reach me." Bradford nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he erased the whiteboard. "I have been. I wanted to apologize, but I also wanted to do it right. I've been working with Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who specializes in bias training. I've been volunteering here for 4 months. I've been trying to understand what I did wrong and how to do better." Victoria studied his face, looking for signs of the arrogance that had characterized their first meeting. She didn't see any. Instead, she saw something that looked like genuine remorse and what might have been wisdom earned through suffering. "Tell me what you've learned," Victoria said, taking a seat in one of the student chairs. Bradford sat down across from her, no longer the commanding presence he had been at JFK. "I learned that I was raised to believe that success gave me the right to judge others. I learned that I confused having money with being worthy, and I assumed that people who looked different from me were somehow less deserving of respect." He paused, clearly struggling with the words. "I learned that my prejudices weren't just morally wrong, they were stupid. I made assumptions about you based on stereotypes, and those assumptions led me to disrespect one of the most accomplished people I'd ever met. I destroyed my own life because I couldn't see past the color of your skin." Victoria listened without interrupting, watching Bradford's face as he spoke. She could see that these weren't rehearsed talking points. They were hard-won insights that had cost him everything he once valued. "What do you want from me?" Bradford, Victoria asked. "I want to apologize, really apologize for how I treated you. But more than that, I want to ask if there's any way I can help prevent other people from making the same mistakes I made." Bradford leaned forward, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "I've been working with corporate diversity trainers, sharing my story as an example of how prejudice can destroy everything you've built. I've been talking to executives who think they're immune to bias, helping them understand that discrimination isn't just a moral failing. It's a business disaster waiting to happen." Victoria considered this. "You're asking me to help you rebuild your reputation?" "No," Bradford said firmly. "My reputation is gone, and it should be. I'm asking you to help me turn my failure into something useful. I'm asking for the chance to spend the rest of my life making sure that other people don't treat anyone the way I treated you." The classroom fell silent except for the distant sounds of activity from other parts of the community center. Victoria studied Bradford's face one more time, looking for any sign of the entitlement and arrogance that had characterized their first meeting. Instead, she saw something unexpected, genuine humility, and what appeared to be authentic commitment to change. "I have a proposition for you," Victoria said finally. "The Monroe Foundation is launching a new program called Leadership Accountability. We're going to train corporate executives about the real costs of discrimination, not just the moral costs, but the business costs." Bradford's eyes widened with something that might have been hope. "I want you to be our primary case study," Victoria continued. "I want you to tell your story, all of it. The prejudices you were raised with, the assumptions you made about me, the way your discrimination destroyed your business and your family. And I want you to help train other executives to recognize and overcome their own biases." Bradford was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of Victoria's offer. "You're offering me redemption," he said finally. "I'm offering you purpose," Victoria corrected. "Redemption is something you'll have to earn over time. But purpose, the chance to prevent others from making your mistakes, that's something we can start working on immediately." Bradford nodded slowly. "What would that look like?" "It would mean traveling to corporate boardrooms and leadership conferences, standing in front of CEOs and executives, and telling them exactly how your prejudices cost you $900 million and destroyed your family. It would mean being a living reminder that discrimination has real consequences." Victoria paused, studying Bradford's reaction. "It would mean giving up any hope of returning to your old life and committing to spending your remaining years in service of something larger than yourself." Bradford looked around the classroom where he had been teaching, thinking about the students who had trusted him with their financial futures, people who had every reason to distrust someone who looked like him, but had given him a chance to prove his worth through his actions rather than his appearance. "Ms. Monroe," he said finally, "I would be honored to work with your foundation. Not because I think I deserve a second chance, but because I know that other people deserve to be treated better than I treated you." Victoria stood up, extending her hand to Bradford. "Then let's get started." The partnership between Victoria Monroe and Bradford Ashworth became one of the most powerful forces for change in American corporate culture. Bradford's transformation from entitled billionaire to humble advocate was documented in a series of Harvard Business School case studies that became required reading in business ethics courses. Their joint presentations to corporate audiences were riveting. Victoria would speak about the psychology of discrimination and the business case for inclusion. Bradford would follow with a brutally honest account of how his prejudices had destroyed everything he valued. I want you to imagine losing everything Bradford would tell audiences of executives. Your business, your family, your reputation, your social standing. All of it gone in 45 minutes because you couldn't treat another human being with basic dignity. The impact was immediate and profound. Companies began implementing stronger accountability measures. Executives started examining their own biases more critically, and most importantly, discrimination complaints in corporate settings began to decline as leaders understood the real consequences of prejudicial behavior. 3 years after their first meeting in Queens, Victoria and Bradford were invited to speak at the United Nations about corporate accountability and social justice. Their story had become a global example of how dignity, accountability, and genuine redemption could transform not just individuals, but entire organizational cultures. "The question we ask ourselves," Victoria told the assembled delegates, "is not whether people can change, but whether they choose to change." Bradford Ashworth chose to examine his prejudices, confront his failures, and dedicate his life to preventing others from making the same mistakes. She looked over at Bradford, who was sitting quietly in the audience, no longer the arrogant billionaire who had tried to humiliate her in an airport lounge, but a man who had earned his dignity through service to others. That choice, Victoria continued, transforms justice from punishment into progress, and redemption from a privilege into a responsibility. In the end, the story of Victoria Monroe and Bradford Ashworth became more than just a cautionary tale about discrimination. It became a testament to the possibility of genuine change, the power of holding people accountable for their actions, and the truth that dignity once claimed can never again be taken away. The Crown Lounge at JFK still operates as an exclusive space for premium passengers, but now prominently displayed near the reception desk is a simple plaque that reads, "Excellence is not about where you come from, but about how you treat others along the way." And sometimes, late at night, when the terminal is quiet, the staff will tell the story of the day when dignity triumphed over prejudice, when justice arrived with a phone call, and when two people discovered that the most powerful change happens not when we destroy our enemies, but when we help transform them into advocates for the very values they once opposed. Justice, it turned out, wasn't about winning or losing. It was about making sure that everyone who came after would be treated with the dignity they deserved from the very beginning. This story proves that standing up to discrimination with dignity and determination can change not just individual lives, but entire industries. Victoria Monroe showed us that true power isn't about seeking revenge, but about creating lasting change that protects others from experiencing the same injustice. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to help us share this important message with more people. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of justice and transformation. And most importantly, share this video with someone who needs to hear that their dignity matters. Their worth isn't determined by others' prejudices, and that sometimes standing up with quiet strength can move mountains. Remember, change starts with each of us choosing to treat others with the respect they deserve, regardless of how they look or where they come from. Together, we can build a world where discrimination has no place and dignity prevails. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.